Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual distance learning opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt. I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. I'm happy today to welcome Libby Bischof from the University of Southern Maine to talk about Maine history. I will let you know that this is the first kind of impromptu session based on feedback from earlier sessions. There is a question saying, what else would you like to learn about? And Maine history kept popping up, basically some level of a Maine history 101. What do I need to know to teach Maine history, some of the basics? I reached out to Libby, who was gracious enough to agree to share her time today. I will also promote and plug that Thursday afternoon, 11 o'clock? I shouldn't quote the time. Libby will also be hosting another session on Thursday talking about the resources available from the Osher Map Library as well. So you've got two opportunities to learn from Libby this week. And with no further ado, Libby, I'm going to give you the screen and feel free to take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for spending an hour of your day with me. I'm actually at work in my office, which feels pretty amazing because, like many of you, I'm also homeschooling a child, a second grader in my case. And the morning Zoom meeting with his teacher is really the highlight of my day because that's the 1 hour I turn over his education to the educators. So thank you for all of your work, both then and now in our new reality. It's great to see everybody. Just a tiny bit of background about me. I am currently the executive director of the Osher Map Library at USM in Portland. I am a professor of history at USM. I actually specialize in Maine history, and I've been teaching some form of Maine history at USM for the last 13 years. I have about 6 different Maine history classes right now. I'm teaching a class on, which I've also had to convert to distance learning like you, on a history of art in Maine. I'm a cultural historian. I specialize in photo, but I teach the general Maine history survey as well, and I also train a lot of teachers. I have a Maine history class that's called Teaching Maine History that can be taken at the undergrad or grad level that I often do in the summer if people are interested. And I know many of you and don't know a lot of you, but it's nice to see your faces. This is very informal. This is not a lecture. This is really my, your opportunity to pick my brain, to ask me questions. I have a bunch of really useful resources that I can click into and share my screen with, just to let you know about some really great resources for Maine history that I turn to time and time again as kind of trusted sources. I'm really happy to help brainstorm projects around Maine history for students at any level, particularly thinking of in a digital world. And I'm happy to do that both here for the hour that we're together and offline as well. I'll share my email in the chat. Pardon if it takes a little bit to get back to you. It's a little nuts right now, as you can imagine. So with that, I'm gonna open up to questions, and if you have particular things you'd like me to talk about, particular things you'd like me to highlight, let me know. I can talk extemporaneously about Maine history for hours, but I'm here to serve you. So my first question in the chat is from Dennis, and then I'll call on. So looking for history books to read during this time, Maine and otherwise. One of the reasons I wanted to be in my office, because one of my bookshelves is behind me, and it's my Maine bookshelf. If you're looking kind of for a general overview of Maine history that's very readable, would be very readable by high school students as well, is Colin Woodard's Lobster Coast. It definitely takes a coastal perspective on history. Came out in 2008. It is the first book I have Maine history students read every semester, really for the past 10, 12 years. It does a wonderful job at kind of overviewing hundreds of years of Maine history. I would say also in terms of statehood, I'm sure you know that we're in our bicentennial year, which will probably continue into 2021 because all of my colleagues are very sad that none of you can see the exhibits we've been working on for the past few years for another couple of months. But I would say the single best, it may not be like, it's dry, but it's very helpful. The single best resource on Maine statehood and how Maine became a state. Actually, Maine Historical is coming out with a reprint at the governor's behest, should be out in a couple of months, is Ronald Banks's How Maine Became a State. It's from the 70s, and there'll be a new edition coming out soon. That is really the most cut and dried walkthrough of the whole process of statehood. If anyone's really into the Revolutionary War and you want to think about the impact of the Revolutionary War in Maine and for statehood, a really engaging book is Jim Lehman's Revolution Down East. Jim is retired from Bates. It's super readable. Students have had a lot of good reaction to that book over the years. I love memoir. I also teach a lot of fiction when I teach history. So if I'm trying to teach like a general feel of 19th century Maine history, I often have students read Sarah Orne Jewett's A Country of the Pointed Firs, which is definitely an 88-page novella that is free online. She does a really wonderful job of that funny transitional point in 19th century Maine history where seaborne industry is kind of falling off, the tourism industry is picking up, villages are having to transition their day-to-day community life. And at D. Terrio, who just asked me if there'll be a list, I will be happy to make you a list, and Joe can tell me how to get it for you. I have a good bibliography for you. So Country of the Pointed Firs is great. If you haven't read Monica Wood's memoir, When We Were the Kennedys, which is about her life growing up in Oxford and around the mills in Rumford, the Oxford paper mill. It's absolutely fantastic about working class Maine life, immigration, community issues, memory. It's just a wonderful read. Response to Amber, the best book about Malaga Island. So that's a couple fold depending on the level that you're teaching. There's a really wonderful catalog that the University of Southern Maine Art Gallery produced last year when Daniel Minter was our artist in residence. And I mention it because it's available in a PDF, and it has some of the top Malaga scholars like Kate McBrien, like Rob Sanford, like Daniel himself, writing these, Kate McMahon, writing these little small, like 5-page essays on the major issues around the history of the island and its life. I will share my screen on that in a second just so you can see it. It's a PDF that you can download that would be very readable for students. If you're teaching at the middle school level, Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy is a novel about Malaga Island. Gary Schmidt, I believe, is the author. I have taught that with middle school students and USM middle school students from Scarborough and USM students in a collaboration we had a few years ago where we all read it and discussed it together. It's a really terrific book for introducing, I would say even early high school, even 9th grade, and it's cheap. Copies of it are like $5-6. And they also made it into a traveling play too. And there, I think it's still online, but I will check for you. Their WMPG at USM, in conjunction with the SALT documentary studio many years ago, put to Malaga Island Stories Best Left Untold. And it's a radio documentary with some interviews around Malaga that's fabulous. I'll try to see if the link to that is still accessible. Deborah asks, related to this, best text to use with 7th graders to teach Maine history. That's a great question. If you don't mind, I'm just gonna turn around and get something on my bookshelf. Be right back. Hopefully I'm gonna do that. So this might be the single only time you're gonna see me talk about a textbook, which are not my favorite. But many years ago now, the University of Maine Press put out a book called Finding Katahdin, an exploration of Maine's past. And it's a particularly social studies geared text for the middle school level. It, like any textbook, has some issues. However, It's a really good general overview of Maine history. It has wonderful discussion questions in it, and there's a whole set of corresponding lesson plans on the Maine Historical Society's Maine Memory Network website that go along with the book. So in terms of like pulling together some basic lessons for people at the middle level, that would be a very useful resource for you to have. There's a lot of good vocabulary in it. It's well illustrated. It's got some weird parts where it has conversations between fake people in the past that sometimes I can't get over. But as a general text, it's really good. For you, good one volume if you're really trying to absorb a lot of detailed Maine history that then you want to turn around and kind of present to your students. I would present Exhibit B, maybe. I should have had my Vanna White. But Maine, the Pine Tree State, which was like a college level Maine history textbook, it's really more like a collection of articles from different authors. It's dry. I don't assign it to my students as much anymore. But in terms of like being packed with history and really wonderful bibliographies for each chapter, I would recommend that as well. I'm going to share my screen for just a minute. Forgive me, as many hours as I spend on Zoom and in administrative calls, I don't do a ton of screen sharing, so bear with me for 1 second. I just want to make sure that you know about this particular, oh, here we go. Convenient. Can you see the Maine History Online website that is up? Thank you for the thumbs up, Dennis, because you guys are all really small now. So many of you probably know a lot about the Maine Memory Network. This is a wonderful primary source collection that's a collaborative of over 250 museums, archives, historical societies that the Maine Historical Society hosts. This is slightly different. It's related to it, but it's a separate piece of it. So Maine History Online is actually a digital textbook. And once this came out 6 or 7 years ago, I stopped assigning a physical textbook to save my students money and assign this instead. The best thing about Maine History Online is that it allows you as a historian to think about Maine history in two ways. And actually, this is what I always struggle with in teaching the Maine History Survey. Do you do it chronologically, which is like the natural inclination in history? But Maine history also really beautifully lends itself to being taught thematically. And so if you struggle with that, this website's awesome because it does both. It gives you time periods like a chronological history that you can see here, starting with Indigenous Maine history, which I'll talk more about in a second. I know there are some questions there for some good resources, which I'm happy to share. But it also lets you do it thematically. So if you look at something like living off the land and sea, you can see that these are quick 5-page chapters. They're really easy to have students look at. They've linked it to exhibits on the side of primary sources that you can go through. You could assign students to go through particular exhibits if you wanted to, particularly look more about herrings and sardines. There's some wonderful short films that you could have students watch that are right on the website. It embeds primary sources right in it. So if you want to, if you kind of skip ahead to page 3, you can look at haying. I use this picture all the time. If you want to look at this E.S. Dingley corn shop crew and huskers from Farmington in 1900. So it's great in that it's kind of interactive, illustrated, short, and it is really readable at every kind of level. I would say from even a good 6th grader could read this. This is a piece that people miss on this website all the time, so my cursor is circling around it. There is a wonderful essay called Thinking About History, a conversation across time and space. And if you're teaching students research or how to use evidence, and you want to do it with a Maine bent, This essay, which was actually written by my friend Beth DeWolf at UNE, is a beautiful essay about how historians work, the types of things we consider. She's really great on women's history. She looks at alternate narratives. She looks at all different kinds of sources and people and context. And it's really a fantastic essay for anything you're teaching about history, or even for yourself, about what we do and sort of why we do it. And that's also eminently readable for students. So when I teach Maine history, or if I teach research methods, this is an essay that I always have people use. So if you're really, for yourself, like looking for a really good basic overview of Maine history with some wonderful primary sources, and that's easily accessible to you while you're at home, this is where I would go. And I will share a list of websites too, just so you have all of this stuff. Another one that students sometimes find fun, and actually has been contributed to by a lot of students and teachers, it's a tertiary source. It reads like an encyclopedia, but Maine an encyclopedia, I really do love the tagline at the top. Those seeking cold, hard statistics on Maine communities won't be disappointed. I don't know if that's the best selling point for this. However, it's really good on individual Mainers, individual aspects of Maine history. If there's an event, if there's a person, if there's a township, that you want just some basic information on, or you want to send students in to do research, it's good for that. It's definitely something I would recommend in that sense. Let's see. I'm gonna try to go into the chat. Perfect. Okay, so I'm just gonna work my way through the chat for a minute. So there are a few questions thinking about introductions to Indigenous history, particularly in Maine. One of the things that I stress constantly with my students, and I have a hard time talking and typing at the same time, but I will try to do that as I look up one resource for you. So if you haven't had the opportunity to see the short film Dawnland yet, the documentary about Maine Wabanaki Reach, that really is about dealing with the long-term legacies of settler colonialism through the lens of adoption and DHHS, and the massive rate at which Native children were taken and continue to be taken from their homes. This was a large truth and reconciliation project that Maine really led the nation on. And Dawnland is the first documentary about the project. There's a couple follow-ups. Let me just go to the Dawnland website, which I will share with you on my screen momentarily, because they have a wonderful curriculum. So this is the Upstander Project. These are the people who made the documentary, Dawnland. And one of the things, they have another short documentary, Dear Georgina, which is great to watch. They have another short documentary, First Light, which is also you can download and watch. This is something that I think you could easily watch with maybe 10th grade up. It requires a lot of context. Might be hard to do when you're not there in person together to answer questions in terms of thinking about trigger warnings in a sense with students. If students come from a situation where they've been in foster care, if they were adopted, or if they have issues around this, it might be a hard thing for them to watch. It's certainly something I've dealt with in teaching it in college. But the teacher's guide for Dawnland, I'm just gonna click on it here. They will email it to you. They have a viewer's guide. They have a teacher's guide. It has 12 lessons in it. And they have so many resources in there with various documents and how to think about them in Maine and beyond. If this is, if you have some time to do some learning of your own, yeah, right now, maybe in the summer again, this website would be something to spend some some really good time on. This is just an example of a summary of the Phipps Bounty, the compelling question, sources around it, excerpts from it, and also with full discussion questions of it. So this is a place to start. And one of the things that comes out in the teacher's guide that's been really useful for my students, I taught it in Maine history last year and this year, is that they frame, there's an Indigenous scholar who teaches at UMaine, Gasutamuk, who also wrote part of this teacher's guide. And he has this kind of way of teaching Indigenous history and Maine history where he talks about the view from the ship and the view from the shore. This would resonate. I've taught this to my 8-year-old and he gets it. But my college students really resonated with this. And once I introduced thinking about the native perspective as the view from the shore and the colonizer perspective as the view from the ship, whenever we looked at sources for the rest of the semester, they would be like, Libby, this comes from the perspective of the ship, right? Where's the voice of the shore? It was this metaphor that just like clicked immediately with them. And I think is very visual for students at all levels. So for one, this is a place that I would start. Another really interesting thing, if any of you are teaching civics or government or contemporary issues, it's a really great idea to have students read LD 291, which is the law that requires the teaching of Maine Native American Indigenous history at every level in the Maine curriculum. You can get the text of LD 291 easily online, and it's really interesting to ask them to read it. It's 4 pages, and to think about what their own experiences have been like in learning this history in their own education. A few of you asked about Wabanaki stories and authors of interest. To this end, Donna Loring, who is currently Janet Mills's kind of special director of Indigenous Affairs in Maine, wrote a memoir about her time in the Maine state legislature that's called In the Shadow of the Eagle. And she was the one that really did the yeoman's work of kind of shepherding this law through. And she, In the Shadow of the Eagle, is really like diary excerpts from her time doing this. And it's really enlightening. My students, of all the books I assigned last semester in Maine history, that was their favorite in terms of being the most kind of contemporary and impactful and thinking about Indigenous issues. So some things to think about at different levels. Certainly, one of the things that you're going to find in a lot of early Maine history books that were written in the 19th and early 20th century, and one of the things I think that's really important to reckon with now with Maine history and students, is that you open the book and it starts when, you know, the first white people land here. And I think that perception of Maine history as being only 400 years and not 12,000 years lingers in a lot of ways. There's a wonderful text. The retired Maine State archaeologist Bruce Bork wrote a text called 12,000 Years. It's a history of Native Americans in Maine. If you can get your hands on that, it's wonderful. It takes you through all the time periods and where people lived and how they lived and what they did and how they worked. Really from the archaeological perspective, which is kind of interesting, but a great resource in that sense. And if you haven't been on the Abbey Museum's website, I'll move on to one of the next questions in just a second. But the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, they just got a new director, Chris Newell, who's Passamaquoddy. He's an educator. To have an educator as the executive director of that museum is such wonderful, wonderful news. He's a great guy. And it's exciting to have that perspective leading a place like the Abbey Museum. But they have fantastic educators, Star Kelly especially, if any of you have worked with her. And if you go to the Abbey, they have really incredible, they're physically closed, but they have really wonderful learning resources if you play around on their website. And so if you go right to education, you go to collections, you can go to the Educator Hub. And at the Educator Hub, It helps you bring this into the classroom, and this is K through 12. So definitely spend some time on these educator resources. As you can see, all of these lesson plans are built out by grade from the Indigenous perspective. It's a decolonized museum. It's a really wonderful resource. You also have, if you're working on with very young kids and working on language and vocabulary and speaking, they have some really wonderful language lessons too that students can do to learn different words in Passamaquoddy in this case, as you can see. So those are some of my go-to Native history resources. Darcy, you are asking me about Maine immigration and migration history. That there's a lot of wonderful work on that. I would go for my go-to back to Maine history online, and I would start students with Peopling Maine, which talks about just that, does a lot with immigration, migration, there's a lot of really wonderful pop-out exhibits on various groups who came in, like when Maine went to Sweden in the 1870s to recruit a large Swedish population to found New Sweden, which is kind of an interesting story for people. There's a lot on 19th century Irish immigration, Franco immigration. There's a great bibliography here on issues. I would also say on Maine memory about maybe I have no sense of time anymore, maybe 3 years ago, Maine Historical did an unbelievable exhibit called 400 Years of New Mainers. Essentially here we go. Essentially basing off the premise that if you're not Indigenous, you're all immigrants to Maine over the past 400 years. And they have tons of resources left over from that exhibit. And so I would 100% recommend that to you as a place to start with students, and you can learn a lot more about particular experiences of individual immigrants and their families to Maine throughout time. Reza and there's a wonderful slideshow on New Mainers as well. So I would start there on immigration for sure, if you're looking to kind of teach that history. Middle school friendly sources that deal with the part Maine played in the War of 1812. It's funny about the War of 1812. No one really taught it until 9/11, when the US was attacked on its own soil again, its continental United States soil, with the exception of Pearl Harbor, for the first time since the War of 1812. And then with the anniversary, the 200th anniversary of the war 8 years ago now, there was a lot more that came out on Maine in the War of 1812. For that level, there are some good documents on the War of 1812 on the Maine Memory Network. I think thinking about that age of students, there's a really interesting story about the boats, the Boxer and the Enterprise, who were a British ship and an American ship who fought a battle out kind of past Casco Bay. And the commanders of both ships, even being from different sides, were buried side by side in the Eastern Cemetery with a massive parade through town. Which is kind of interesting, and there's a lot on the Boxer and Enterprise as a story that could be kind of translated for students of that age that I would definitely think about. Let's see. I am trying to see the chat again, which has been lost on my screen. Give me 2 seconds. Oh, here it is. It was hiding behind your window. There's another question, and I'll answer this question then, and I'll open it up to the people I can see and stop sharing my screen. Oh, virtual field trips I will talk about too. Books to recommend for grades 3 through 5. When I think about, I mean, in this sense, I think about books about Maine's history that I would share with my son. There's a really wonderful book called Keep the Lighthouse Burning, Abby, about a little girl, maybe like 3rd or 4th grade, who, as the title said, kept the lighthouse burning during like a 19th century event, which is really good for students of that age. Advanced 5th graders could 100% handle, or not even advanced, like I think actually a lot of 5th graders could handle the Malaga Island novel, Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy. I think 5, 6, and 7 would get, and 8 even would get a lot out of that in kind of different ways. It really is a story about a friendship between 2 kids who are like 11 or 12. So it's certainly accessible in that way. They made a graphic novel of Lost on a Mountain in Maine, that classic Maine story, that would be great for 4th and 5th graders, I think. Wonderfully illustrated, and a story about a boy being lost in the woods that was a huge part of Maine history, which I would definitely recommend. I would also do some Longfellow poems with even 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders. There are some pretty simple rhyming ones. I mean, some are a little epic and long, but there are some that you could take out in that sense to do that. And I can think a little bit more about that age as well as we go along. That's the stuff that comes to mind right away. In terms of virtual field trips that someone asked about, it depends what types of places you would want students to be able to go. One of the things that comes to mind right from the start is visiting different monuments and memorials. So if you give me a second, I'll show you 2 ways to do that. During the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, Earl Shuttleworth, the state historian, made this site that sits on maine.gov. I hope you can see it, but it's just maine.gov/Civil War /monuments. And if you click on the name of any city or town, and he did a pretty comprehensive survey, so let's say we pick on Gardner, it will take you to the monument in that town as it looks today, where it's located, materials that it's made of, the inscriptions, and then some different contemporary and historic images. That might be fun for people to do. My students and I, during the Maine World War I centennial, did a huge project.
Can you turn that light back on?
Is it me? Hold on.
Yep.
Can you see? We did a big Maine World War I memorials site that you can visit. And so we broke it down by county. I'll just go to Cumberland, since that's where I'm sitting. You can see a map of all of them, so they can take a virtual tour over on the side. If you kind of hold it over the map point, it will take you there too. But let's say we wanted to go to Bridgeton. It gives you the full inscription. We really transcribed a lot, where it is, the photo itself. It allows you to zoom in and think about different things in towns. Those are 2 things that come to mind in that sense about physical places to visit. I know every museum in Maine right now is working double time on getting its education programs online for people. I'll talk more about ours at the Osher Map Library, specifically on Thursday's webinar, but we have a ton of downloadables just to show you. I'm not going to go into any great detail on this. I'm just going to show you the main thing. If you're on oshermaps.org and you go to teach, You can see field trips and class visits. You can't come to us now, but if you did, we see about 5,000 K through 12 students a year, both on site here, and we go to your classrooms as well. But we have tons of downloadable activities and lesson plans. I'll just show you educational games. There's one that's really fun that your kids could do while you're home. It's called Touring Maine. You can download the game board and the cards. It's ages 8 and up. And all kids would need to do this at home is like a dice from another game and something to use as a piece. So you could do any of that. We've got tons of games, and these were all games that were developed by our education specialists. So anything from mythology to trains to the history of the United States, there's all kinds of stuff on here. We'll talk more about that on Thursday, but just some Maine-based stuff for you to see. And also, I know my educator, Renee, who should be on the call on Thursday, was also talking to me about how she had gotten more Maine studies lessons built out. So yeah, you can see them here. Earliest maps of Maine, Aristic War, interactive trivia games and things like that. So there's lots of stuff here. The age level of those games vary anywhere K through 12, depending on the game and depending on how you use them. Our most frequently seen classes are grades 3, 4, and 5. So you will find a lot of middle grade resources on our website because those are our most popular constituents. In terms of virtual field trips into Maine's past, there was a website that I wanted to show you today that maybe not everyone is as familiar with as they should be. They're also some of my favorite people. So I wanted to show you, let's see if I can go back and get it. Just give me 1 second. So in Searsport, Maine, we have the Penobscot Marine Museum, and it's an absolutely amazing place to take people in person. However, they have the largest photography collection in the entire state. They have over 150,000 photos. And Kevin and Matt have put so many of these online. And so there are these wonderful little slideshows that take you through a lot of maritime history. The Eastern Illustrated and Publishing Company Images Archive is great. It's more than 10,000 glass plate photographs of the state of Maine from like 1909 through 1947. There's some little videos about it. You can find your town. And so you can see also these interactive slideshows when you go to view images. And, or not on that one. You can. And then you can also search their collections. So if you go to collections, search database, you will come up with tons of photographs and things that you can share with students. And I do activities on this stuff all the time. And it's applicable to every level. If you were even working, you wanted a little warm-up activity for your 4th graders or your 5th graders, if you're doing Zoom meetings with them, you could bring up a photo, share your screen, have them do a little writing prompt, have them think about what's going on in the picture. You can ask them, what do they see here? What do they think's going on? How do they know this? You can do a little visual thinking activity with them. Which is like a great 10-minute warm-up just to get kids thinking and talking at any level. I do this with my college students too. They can do a lot with these photos. So I would definitely fool around with their collections. The other one, I'm gonna go to YouTube for a second, but I'm gonna go in a targeted way. So I'm sorry if it starts talking to me. So Northeast Historic Film in Bucksport, Maine is another one of my favorite museum and archives to partner with. They have a lot of their stuff online. I'm going to their YouTube channel right now. It's just Northeast Historic Film. And if you look at playlists, they had a grant-funded project a few years ago for Hancock County. If any of you were there, even if you're not, these are wonderful. And they digitized all of these amazing short early films from all over Maine. And for me, these are like the greatest virtual field trips in time. And it's like Ellsworth High School playing at the Boston Garden in 1953 to lobstering off Bar Harbor in 1929, paper mill field days. There's some great parades. There's a lot of news items from the 70s. The Civil Defense Shelter in Bucksport in '68 is pretty amazing. There's so much here. I teach with these all the time. Students love them. A lot of them are very short, and it's really engaging, I think, for them to see things that are so familiar to them. And even if you think about the 1950s being 70 years ago, right? It takes you back in time. There's a circus train from Ellsworth in the 1930s. I would really, in terms of like virtual field trips, I would really recommend these. They're totally charming and a lot to do. Oh, I just thought of a good book for kids for 3rd and 5th graders. Charlotte's Web is all set in Maine. And I thought of that because there's a bunch of E.B. White videos on here too, because they have his collection from Brooklyn, Maine. And so thinking about kind of Maine agricultural life and kids living on farms would pair with some of this stuff too. So what else would you like from my brain? How can I help? Granite Industry, can do. Okay. There is a great, I'm going to do Northeast Historic Film again. Oh, I just thought of something else too. Hold on. My brain works faster than my mind can work. Give me 1 second to show you an industry thing that you can have for only $1 if Sumner is still doing it. And if not, I'll send you the link. I'll find it in my email in a second. So there's this great Maine filmmaker and musician named Sumner McCain. And he has made a whole series of films about Maine history. In the Blood is about the logging industry and is absolutely fantastic. The Maine Frontier is incredible. It's about Isaac Simpson, this guy who was like a jack of all trades working around northern Maine, illustrating life. The Speedway is on actually the Oxford racetrack. But the coolest thing about this is I just got an email from Sumner this week where he opened up all of his films for download and streaming for $1. So I need to try to find you the link to that because you can literally download each one of these films for $1. And then you can share those with students and have them do that. These are absolutely fantastic on industry. Oh, the Craig, the logging industry one is this film down here, In the Blood, by Sumner McCain, which is absolutely fantastic. The other logging industry thing that is amazing, and I will get back to Granite, I have not forgotten, what is it called? Maine, this is how my Google works, logging film, King Spruce. I will try to find this online for you because I definitely have been able to download it before. But King Spruce was a lumber safety film made in the 1940s, and it's incredible. It's narrated like Disney movie 1940s style and shows the whole logging process in the Maine woods. It's 23 minutes long. Students love it. In terms of Granite, there are at least 2 or 3 if not more. Oh yes, someone asked about YouTube too while I'm here. At home in Maine. Let me see if I can find this for you. You can find a bunch of these on YouTube, but it looks like you can get some of them on the MPBN site as well. These are from like the early 2000s, and sometimes they sound like it, but there are these 20 to 30 minute episodes on Maine history that are really great overviews for students and you. They have some of them on YouTube too. There's another YouTube series that I'm thinking of that's going to take me a second. Let me just go back to Maine memory just to show you a Granite thing. The Vinyl Haven Historical Society, I don't know to what end they're kind of online or up and running right now, has amazing stuff on the granite industry, by the way. And a wonderful short documentary film that they made about 10, 15 years ago that's still really great. So as you can see, there's all kinds of primary sources on the granite industry, on Maine memory. One of the things that I like to focus on with students in terms of granite is thinking about where all the granite from Maine went and what that looks like. And they don't have any sense of how much of an industry this was in Maine until you start looking at like pictures and postcards of some of this work. This is a wonderful picture. Like this is just in Hallowell, which is amazing to kind of think about the skilled labor who was working in here. And you can do anything from company stores to work life. And there's all kinds of like, there's quarry schoolhouses for kids. Here's Mount Waldo. So there's endless granite stuff on Maine memory that I would heartily recommend, or check out the Vinyl Haven Historical Society. What else? Someone had mentioned really early on, Jess, it might have been you, was thinking about Maine during the Great Depression. And certainly any of you who are teaching US history, I teach US history a lot, or used to before I started running a giant map library. But often when I teach US history at USM, when I can, I link US history to what's happening here in Maine. I find that the local history gets the students way more engaged and connected to issues. And certainly in terms of US history, one way to teach the Great Depression on a national level is certainly to also look at it in Maine. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the 1930s Depression era photographers that were employed by the Farm Security Administration, people like Dorothea Lange. All of those photos you can see at the Library of Congress. My favorite primary source site is the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs collection, their online catalog. The amount of stuff they have digitized is truly mind-blowing. From Civil War to farm security to kind of everything in between. But one of the things that I would say in terms of the Great Depression are those photos, which I'll show you a cheat for in a minute. But a less used resource is maybe the Works Progress Administration posters. And they were almost 1,000 posters that were produced all over the country for different events and things that people were using, different theater projects that were put on, different writing projects, zoos going up, events, community activities, all things the government was infusing money into. And so you can search the site directly. There is more than one in Maine, but I'll show you this one because it's cute. There's one on skiing and winter sports, but these posters are terrific as a resource. The other, so they're fun to play with and to have students do work with. The other thing would be FSA. So you can do the Farm Security Association photographs just by Maine and come up with all kinds of things. This is really beautiful. I could look at photo all day. But you can see all of these really pictures of Maine in the 1930s and 40s that haven't really been seen. If you want your students to have a much easier access than this, a few years ago, Yale got a huge grant to essentially take all of the images of the Farm Security Administration collections at the Library of Congress and put them on an interactive map called photogrammer.yale.edu. And if you look at the interactive map, this is really fun to play with. I won't belabor the point, but you can see photos by county. So if you say, okay, what did the FSA take in Cumberland? You can click on that and see every picture they took in Cumberland County. The really cool thing about Photogrammer, which I wish they had started working on this more, is they do these visualizations. So the Farm Security Administration came up with this unbelievable categorization system. This is not Yale, this is the FSA in the 1940s. If you're teaching US history especially, so you can say, I only want to see pictures of homes and living conditions. And then you can say, but I only want to see household activities, and I only want to see toilets. And here are all the pictures of toilets that were taken by Farm Security Administration photographers. If you're thinking of having students compare over place and time and situation and poverty in the Great Depression, it's so interactive and it's so great. And it's not, if you want to see images of women doing domestic labor and housework, which is one of the hardest things to find photographed, you can see kitchens and that kind of work and the stuff of daily life here. So I would highly recommend this site. It's really amazing. And very easy to work with kids online during remote learning and have them do this could be, you know, you could teach it to them in a few minutes in the morning and kind of advance them. Maine had a very different reaction to the Great Depression than most states. We were one of the 2 states, along with Vermont, who voted against Roosevelt in '36. Mainers were very reluctant to take federal government, quote unquote, handouts and preferred to handle it on their own. There's a lot of writing on this, actually. The FSA sent like roving reporters in to interview people, and people in Maine were like, no, we don't want any of this, go home. With few exceptions, one of them being the Civilian Conservation Corps. And I just wanted to show you this on the Maine State Archives site. They have a really wonderful collection of materials on the Civilian Conservation Corps in Maine. They were working on all the state parks, building out the stuff at Sebago, doing a lot of the firework. So you can get a full list of CCC members in Maine, a list of tributes to people who worked. You can see where all the CCC camps were in Maine and what they did. So it's a nice little resource and certainly something that students could work on too that's related to the Great Depression. Staying tuned, the Maine State Archives, they promise, but I think COVID might slow this down or speed it up depending on who's working on site. But Maine has started an online archive called Digital Maine Repository that you should all know about. It is the Maine State Library, the Maine State Archives, government agencies, the Maine State Museum. And they have started putting and digitizing a lot of their resources online. I definitely would recommend playing around with this. It's sometimes clunky, but it is great. And one of the really neat things on here is the Maine Historic Newspaper Project. And these are all the Maine historic newspapers that have been digitized, that are freely available without a subscription, and that you can click on to use. And there's some from almost every county. So if you want kids digging into different time periods or doing research or saying like, okay, you have a current events project for, 1839, what was going on in Biddeford in 1825? You could click on the Maine Palladium, you could search, you could go through. This is a very, very underutilized project, I would say. And it's absolutely amazing the amount of work that's been done in Maine to digitize these early newspapers. So I would definitely suggest playing around on that. I used to have to do this junk on microfilm when I was little. So the fact that you can just click on this and see is completely incredible to me. So there's stuff all over the state that you could play around with and that kids could use. So I am mindful that I'm gonna stop my screen share and go back to seeing all you lovely people in person. That we have very little time left. So if anyone has another question or wants some other resources, I will definitely put together a collection of websites and give it to Joe. And I will also send a bibliography to Joe and he can get those out to you this week. Anyone have any last minute things? Joe, anything? Welcome to this peek inside my brain. It's fun talking about Maine history and not making administrative decisions about libraries closing. So I appreciate the hour of joy.
You're doing a really good job when nobody's leaving right at the end. I didn't hear any backpacks being zipped up. Let me drop everybody. Let me get the certificate in there for you. So if you check in the Google chat, let's make sure I got all my turn on 100%. Some of you have heard this multiple times before. Just make sure when you go through, this is going to auto-generate a contact hour certificate for you. So make sure that you have your correct email address in there and make sure you put your correct name in, whatever name you want on the certificate. There's a couple of other questions in there from the department. And then the last question is, did you complete the webinar? You have to hit yes. If you hit no, you will fail the quiz and it will not send you the certificate. This is a 1 out of 1, 100%. So when you get to the end, say, yes, I completed the certificate, and it will auto-generate a contact hour sent to the email address with the name that you put on there. So while people are working on that right now, does anybody have questions for Libby?
Joe, thank you so much for putting all of these together too. And I think when we get out of this time, this is such a cool model for an hour of professional development that people can do from anywhere. I mean, this is something that would be so easy for me to do going forward past COVID and really fun.
Well, that's the, let me end.